Hello and welcome back to APHG Geography with Dustin Fowler. Today we're going to do the second big part of our Unit 3 video review. This is going to be what is Chapter 7 in the Rubenstein book. We're looking at gender, ethnicity, identity, and race. Don't forget there's an interactive study guide in the description. You've got Unit 6 in the previous video that I made, and then Unit 7 in this one. So keep an eye on that. My recommendation is that you print it off and put a little check mark next to things you understand really well, and then go back and click on some of those links to review some of the stuff you're still a little bit concerned, maybe a little bit less understanding of. What is race, ethnicity, and identity? And how are these things social constructs? What does that even mean? When we talk about something as a social construct, we talk about something as a perception of either the individual or as a perception of society, which is arguably the more important of the two. Well, let's look at this example. When we're talking about race, in order to differentiate that from ethnicity, race has to do with simply the physical characteristics of someone, the color of their skin, the color of their eyes, the texture of their hair, the width of the bridge of their nose, for example. These are all things that people use whenever they help to determine what race actually is. Ethnicity kind of encompasses culture, heritage, ancestry, and even race is part of someone's ethnicity. Identity takes those things a little bit further and looks at how individuals perceive themselves and how they identify based on these things, and those things are social constructs. Let me give you an example. If you guys go on to Google and you type up twins, one black, one white, and just hit enter, you're going to see a news article from a year or two ago that literally shows the set of sisters. They're twins, and one of them has red hair and green eyes and is white, and one of them is black by what American standards would be. She's actually a little bit light-skinned, which in places like Brazil would make her white in and of herself. But for all practical purposes, if you saw them on the street, you would call one of them black and one of them white. And so what this means is they can't be of different race because biologically they are twins. Therefore, our perceptions of race and ethnicity are in fact social constructs, and they are whatever everybody else perceives them to be. So both of them might feel white, both of them might feel black, both of them might feel something totally different, but if we think that they are one thing, then we're going to categorize them as that. And that right there is what I mean when I say race, ethnicity, and identity is very much a social construct. Now, if you look a little bit further, what you would see is race is usually used as a measure of societal worth. And if you don't say usually, then certainly in the past it has been. In particular, if you look at how imperials utilized the natives in places where they basically conquered or where they exploited. A good example of this is in Rwanda. You've got two different groups, the Tutsis and the Hutus. Tutsis made up about 30% of the population and were typically shepherds and were a little bit taller and more slender build. And Hutus typically were shorter, stout, with broader shoulders and thicker bridges on their nose, and maybe a different nose length or something like this that the British would use to determine who is going to be better and who is going to be not, based on not only race but also the type of work that they did. The British literally created social stratification between those two groups so that when independence came to Rwanda, the two different groups, Tutsis, came to power as the heads of the government, even though they made up a minority of the population. Now, this kind of ticked off many of the Hutus, and after an election where Hutus won overwhelmingly because of the majority, you see where the role is reversed, and Hutus kind of want revenge on the Tutsis for, their higher prestige in society. And what this ends up doing is creating like a movement where individuals in the mid-90s actually went after one another with machetes, trying to kill off people that were either Tutsis or weren't radical enough on the Hutu side, and caused a massive refugee issue, which resulted in a militia coming back and waging civil war in Rwanda. Meanwhile, everybody just kind of nodded their head and ignored what was going on, and you find out that hundreds of thousands of people got killed in a brutal genocidal type extermination, largely with weapons and things that are very, very personal. When you kill people with a machete, it doesn't get much more upfront in your face than that. What would cause civilians and people to do things like this due to ethnicity? That's part of the things that people are still trying to answer today. Another example of this is if you look at the Atlantic slave trade. Slavery and racism in the United States today largely comes out of the fact that race was single-handedly the deciding factor of whether or not you were free or slave during the European expansion into the Americas. If you were Native American, chances are you would have been enslaved. until it turns out they weren't really very good slaves. And then if you were African or of African descent, in other words black, then you would also have been at risk of being enslaved, even if you were free. The fact that slavery was justified based on color of your skin kind of leads us to the racial tensions that we have today. Black became associated with lower, became associated with worse, and all this based on the color of skin. Eventually, after the Emancipation Proclamation and Reconstruction, Civil War Reconstruction, all that, you have this Jim Crow era, which led to people, or I guess states in particular in the South, creating policies and even laws that were centered on segregation and keeping blacks and whites separate, because the white majority felt like blacks were not as good as the white majority. After the end of the Jim Crow era and ushering in the civil rights movement, where blacks really worked hard to get equal status in the United States of America, you start to see where people use different techniques in order to continue policies of segregation, such as blockbusting, redlining, ghettoization, mortgage discrimination. What do these things mean? Blockbusting is simply when you would have white realtors who would tell a white family that once a black family moved into the neighborhood, that your house is going to go down in value substantially. What this does is it makes them want to sell their house, and they're going to sell at a discount price. All right, so they're going to lose money, and then the person's going to turn around and sell it to a black family for way more than the house is worth and make bank basically on people's fears and people's racial discrimination. This ends up also becoming somewhat of an illegal practice later on. Ghettoization, when we talk about a ghetto in the United States, we associate that with areas for poor, or I guess for low-income black families. But really what the word actually means is you take a minority ethnic group and you separate them into areas that are typically not as good as some of the other areas in a city. And so when we talk about ghettoization, the Jews were ghettoized, or were placed in ghettos in many places in European history. In particular, we talk about this leading up to World War II in Germany and places, that were controlled by the Nazis. In the United States, you see this practice actually in some of our bigger cities. Like, for example, if you look at LA, you can see where they might have been some houses kind of near the central business district. These houses were actually dwelling places of some of your original ethnic minorities that locate into that city. Well, as they moved out into suburbs because they start to do a little bit better, many times you would see African Americans come into those areas and kind of dwell in those very same areas. And they were never really fixed up, and so they end up becoming places where, again, blacks are kind of pushed into these ethnic enclaves and in a way segregated from the rest of the community. Mortgage discrimination is when you have individuals that cannot get mortgages and can't buy houses, or either they get mortgages at ridiculous rates due to the color of their skin, due to their ethnic background. It could be either one. Apartheid is very similar to Jim Crow, except takes place in South Africa. And another big difference you're going to see here is that in Jim Crow in the United States, the white population is by far the majority, whereas the black population is by far a minority. Well, it's kind of flip-flopped in South Africa. Whites still dominated, but there was an overwhelming, about 80% of people in South Africa at the time were black. And so they were subjugating, considered less than the white majority, which took the best land and kind of skated off all the blacks living there into some of these, some of the most poor quality land, and also had them crammed in there so that their living conditions were abominable. An important figure of the apartheid movement is Nelson Mandela, who in 1994 gets released from prison. He was there for over 30 years and ends up becoming the president of South Africa. This man actually just died in recent years. You probably remember it when it was in the news. Another thing you gotta know about ethnicity is how this process of ethnicity, nationalization, self-determination all kind of meshes together, and you can see this really well in the breakdown of Yugoslavia. First of all, when you talk about Balkanization, you're talking about this breakdown based on the example in the Balkans. In other words, the former Yugoslavia, which contained many different ethnic groups that essentially vied for power against one another because of nationalism. They start feeling very strong ties to one another, like they belong to one another. If you're a nation, by the way, it's the same more or less as ethnicity. You share common ancestry, common history, common prejudices, common strengths, common language and religion, but you also share a very strong tie to the land in which you live. And well, if you have all these feelings, you start wanting to have a government for yourself. And so you start to see this go into place in Yugoslavia. Now, something else that you start to see is that these national movements didn't really take hold very well. And so in order to justify the self-determination, many groups like your Croats and your Serbs actually started to kill off minorities that lived in that area that challenged their capacity to own that land as a nation state. And so you start seeing where Bosnian Muslims were being completely killed off by Croats and Serbs in the region. Later on, after all that kind of settles down for a little bit, maybe 3 or 4 years later, in the late 1990s, you start seeing where Serbians once again start picking on the Kosovar Albanians, trying to essentially destroy them in the same way that they had done the Bosnian Muslims. And so these are both examples of what were later called genocide or ethnic cleansing, where you're trying to take the entire ethnic group in that region and wipe them out. In a sick, twisted kind of way, this is what caused a degree of peace in that area, is by wiping out the other ethnic minorities. So people look at this and they're like, wow, that's nasty and disgusting. It also shows that when you have strong feelings of self-determination, you're going to have conflict and violence in those areas. And that's not even the only example of this. In Sudan, you have a similar issue that involved Muslims in the north and people that were a combination of animists, Christians in the south. And in the north, they were Arabic, and in the south, they were black and African natives. And so all these different things caused there to be huge amounts of conflict between the two. Not only that, but Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, was fairly well to do, and in the north they were better off than in the south, where they were a little bit more impoverished. All these things caused a civil war that lasted for a very long time and eventually resulted in the breakoff of South Sudan as our newest country on earth. And even now, because of all the different ethnic groups involved in South Sudan trying to create a new government, has also proved to be a breeding place for conflict, as many people from even the United States or people that were refugees in other parts of Africa moved back into South Sudan, and now they're disagreeing on how to create or how to go forward with that government. Syria is another one that we've looked at in the migration unit, when and this is one that's in the news right now. Turn on the news, watch the news, see what's going on in the world around you. What you have is in Syria a government that has a dictatorship, the Assad regime, that represents the Shia minority in Syria. Well, 80% of people in Syria are Sunni Muslims, and during the Arab Spring, these guys started to protest and try to fight out for rights and maybe even for democracy, which we kind of like that. Yay, go democracy. We're the United States. So we started to kind of bat these guys, and eventually it turned into an outright civil war that has lasted to the point that it is, mainly because of geopolitical interest between different groups that are not Syria. Nonetheless, this is something that's very much in the news today, and you see it mostly through these refugees moving into Europe and even the United States. India and Pakistan are another example of ethnic conflict due to religion and ethnicity. Most people in India are Hindu. Hinduism is the religion of India. But there's also a massive load of Muslims that live in there, as you saw in the review for chapter 6. So what happens when you have a ton of Muslims and a ton of Hindus and they don't get along, and the British are also there trying to control things with dealing with the independence movement in India? Well, you have conflict. And so what the British did before they left and gave independence to both India and Pakistan is they carved out the country of Pakistan in the west and in the east, and this basically resulted in a mass migration of Muslims into the Pakistan regions and Indians, or I guess Hindus, into India. And there was a lot of conflict and fighting between these two groups. If you've never seen the movie Gandhi, that talks about Gandhi and his efforts to try to promote peace in India and also try to promote independence, you should definitely go to your local library and rent that. It's a pretty good movie, and will do a good job of showing you a little bit of the conflict between these two groups. In the eastern portion of Pakistan, it later became Bangladesh. They figured out that it's pretty impossible to govern two Pakistans that far apart. So now you've got Bangladesh and Pakistan, both of them with massive populations, both of them making up a huge chunk of the overall Muslim populace. Which brings me to another point. I want you guys to remember that most Muslims live in South and Southeast Asia. In the Kashmir region between Pakistan and India today, there's still a little bit of conflict between Muslims and Hindus, or has been as well, because of the fact that there's not a clear line between the borders. India and Pakistan never agreed on those lines, which has resulted in war in that region. And the people of Kashmir actually either want to be part of Pakistan or want their own country. They want self-determination in some cases. So very nasty conflict there. Another area you gotta know about in India is the Punjab region, which is inhabited by the Sikh population in India, making up about 3 to 4% of the population. These guys are pretty mad that they were left out of the chance to have self-determination in the Punjab region. Lastly, dealing with the philosophy, ideas, and things of this nature, I want you guys to understand what dowry deaths are. Shifting gears a little bit and looking at gender inequalities in India and some of their rural areas. You see, India and China, both of these places are both developed and undeveloped. If you're in certain places, especially the urban areas in these countries, you see a developed country. If you're in the rural areas, you see very vastly underdeveloped region. In India, in some of these rural areas, they still believe in like the caste system. These guys practice dowry, marriage by dowry and predetermined marriage, so arranged marriages. And what happens is the dad will provide a massive dowry to the husband of his of his daughter. And so if the dowry ends up not being big enough based on the fact that the husband's not happy enough or the husband's family is not happy enough with the wife, they might start demanding more dowry from the dad. And if he can't pay it, or even if he does pay it and they still don't like the daughter, they oftentimes will kill the daughter in retribution for not getting good enough dowry. This is especially sad whenever you see that the things that these people are asking for are like big screen TVs and cars and massive sums of money. And it's a major problem. Love marriages are on the rise in India, but if you look at the numbers, they show steady increase continually of dowry deaths from year to year. Massively unfair to women, extremely sad, and the fact this is still going on shows clear inequality on the basis of gender in many places in the world today. Alright, so now we've got a few terms and things down here. I've already looked at a few of them, so in order to make the video speed up, we're not going to look at all these things in great detail. But race, ethnicity, and gender I defined at the beginning of this unit. I also included links here so you guys can look. If you look at the description for the video, there is the interactive study guide. So feel free to take a look at these. Make some flashcards or something. That's a good thing to do in order to learn some of the vocab. In terms of United States ethnic groups, I want you guys to know the big ethnic minorities. First of all, the majority white. There's probably about 65 to 67% of all of us in the United States are white. All right. That's going to change, by the way. By 2045 to 2050, whites are going to make up about 49% of the population and are going to be the largest minority group. Hispanics are the largest minority group currently at about 17% of the population. Blacks at about 12 or 13% of the population. And then after that, you've got Asian Americans. And then your other group would include Native Americans and many others. I also want you guys to understand where these different ethnic groups are clustered. Blacks in the American South, Asians kind of along Hawaii and California, along the West Coast region. Makes sense because of distance decay and also the fact that they're migrating across the Pacific into the United States. I want you also to know that cities are good places for ethnic groups to go because they are places of interaction and openness and the coming together of ideas and different types of everything. The more rural you are, the more homogeneous you are, and the more people might be intolerant. But the more exposed you have to different cultures and the mixing of these different cultures, like cities, which is what they basically are, centers of interaction, trade, and commerce, the more people are going to be accepting of you. Same for people that might be, for example, homosexuals do very well in cities rather than in some countryside town where they might not be accepted. Nationality has to do with one's ties to a certain region based on ancestry, race, culture, religion, language, all these things. A nation state is going to be a state that is, well, let's look at the definition of a state first. A political unit with a government, you got boundaries, you got people living in it. Those are the three things that characterize what a state actually is. A nation is a group of people that are tied by ancestry. They're bonded by heritage and language and culture. If you have a state that has people like that inside of it, it becomes a nation state. Pretty good case scenario because they don't fight as much, right? A stateless nation is going to be a group of people that live in a territory that don't have a state, like the Kurds are a good example of that. Which brings me to the next term. Self-determination simply means the idea that they want to be their own state. They want to have their own government that represents that group of people. Balkanization is a breakdown of a larger area based on these ethnic tensions between one another, like what you would have seen in the Balkans during the breakdown of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia. A centripetal force, similar to the science definition, is things that bring people together, things that make them bond one another. It increases nationalism, for example. All right, so centripetal forces might be when you speak the same language. It might be when you have a government that has 80% approval rating. When you have things of this nature that bring people together and make them feel happy and good inside. Centrifugal forces, on the other hand, are going to be the exact opposite. Things that break people apart. Things that make them want to break away from that main country. And things that end up destroying the political system in a region. Finally, a multinational state is going to be one that has many different nations represented within one border. A best example of this would have been the former Soviet Union that contained all of those Warsaw Pact states. Many of these have independence now, complete independence, but at the time you had 14, 15 national groups represented in the former Soviet Union. This causes massive conflict for governments that try to hold on to that power. Nothing's more difficult than hanging on when people don't want to be held on to. And finally, the section of important groups and countries. Make sure that you guys go through and click on links, look at some of these maps. We've already talked about all these places in the study guide review, so I'm not going to spend any time here looking at this, but just make sure that you go and know these areas in case you see maps or have FRQs that talk about the spatial analysis of these regions and the things we've already discussed. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you got something out of it. I hope you guys are going to do awesome on the test. Like, share, subscribe, let people know what I'm doing here, and good luck. I'll see you guys next time.